If you start from wrong premises, you get to wrong answers. And the premise that I've already alluded to, for those of you who know the sorts of things I think about, is about the nature of who we are. We are fallen sinners, and surely the evidence is overwhelming. Just look at the biblical story for a start. I mean, Adam and Eve get thrown out of the Garden of Eden for disobedience. All that told that their exit is, Eve is told about childbearing, which will not be all fun. And Adam is told about the responsibilities of fathering and feeding the family, which will be the sweat of his brow. And the first two brothers they produce, one murders the other. And God says to Cain before he does the deed, evil is crouching at the gates, and you must control it. God had told him what needed to be done. He'd given him the will to be trained and to do it, but he didn't do it. And that's been the problem ever since. The liberal elite want everything to be a problem of ignorance, but it's not. We all know what good and evil are. We know it in greater or lesser degree, or certainly degrees of sophistication, but we all know it. And it comes hardwired with being human. I repeat time and time again, the first thing a child says that's philosophically interesting is not fair or some equivalent. They don't say, I don't accept your value system, do they? They have an internal value system, which they know. In fact, I wouldn't prefer to call it a value system. I hate the word values because it can be manipulated. It's what I call a weasel word. It can get out of the way very quickly when it wants to, so to speak. No, they have real ideas of good and evil. That's why Lewis, in the first chapter of Mere Christianity, is called Good and Evil. That's the clue to the meaning of the universe. And he uses a conversation between two children to open up the discussion as only Lewis could. I think Romans 7, which many Christians who are suffering from what I call Christian reductionism look upon as a pre-conversion phenomenon. No. Paul's writing to the Romans, and he says, the good that I want to do, I often fail to do. And the evil that I don't want to do, I still slip into it. Who will deliver me from this body of sin? And then he goes on and says that Christ, through the Holy Spirit, will do it. And even that bit, I'm going to misquote it for you, just to annoy you, in a good way, I hope. Paul says in Romans 8, if the Spirit will put to death the deeds of the flesh, you will live. Well, he does say that, but I have destroyed it. You have to put it in context, because he certainly doesn't mean it the way you find many people who recent converts being taught by people who haven't mastered their text will not be doing it properly. So you can go and read Romans 8 and see what he actually says. And you come back to the Sermon on the Mount again. The parable at the end of building on the rock and building on the sand is often used to preach the gospel in a simplistic way. But that's not what it's about at that level. In the Sermon on the Mount, if Starton, all the way back to Augustine, is right, and I certainly totally sold on the concept that the Sermon on the Mount is not about conversion, it's about becoming a disciple. And so Jesus says, what shall I liken a man who hears all these things I've taught you and does them? He is a man building on a rock. And whatever comes, the storms of life will wash against that rock and it will not move. But those who hear my word, they've heard the word, but not paid any real attention, not done the work of thinking about it, working on it, building the mind all the way through the New Testament. If you've understood, you will now do on the basis of understanding. So, but they don't bother with that. He said, they just think, oh, Good, I'm going to heaven. Well, Jesus says, I will keep my part of the bargain, but if you want to have a good life, if you want to have a life that can take the storms of life, you have to build on obedience. The sermon is, the parable is not about believers and unbelievers. It's about doers and non-doers. Those who hear the word and do not do it are building on the sand. And not only is it bad for them, it's bad for the gospel, because people look around and say, if that's what the gospel produces, I don't want it. What they need to see is what they do want. One of the reasons there's huge changes occurring in the world at the moment is because of the internet, not because of the missionaries, especially in the Muslim world. I mean, the missionaries are doing important work, and it will be a long time before it's all worked out. Clearly in China, Hudson Taylor is honored by millions of Christians. But in the Muslim world, it was an extremely hard world to be a missionary in. And primarily because the mullahs held on to the story and there was no other. They kept them ignorant. And then the internet comes along. And younger Muslims look round and they say, what's gone wrong? You've been telling us that we have received the final revelation and there will never be another. We know the truth. Every other religious group has got to bend the knee to Muhammad and Allah. And we're going to rule the world. Well, you've had 14 centuries now, and there's precious little evidence. The Muslim world doesn't make very much at all. Carpets, perhaps. The oil that's made them wealthy was there long before we arrived, but they did nothing with it. It was the Judeo-Christian formed world that knew about work and knew about thought and knew about rationality and had developed experimental science. Wasn't an Enlightenment thing. It antedated the Enlightenment. They could work out what it meant. They thought about things in a way that was productive. One or two Muslims tried, and it wasn't acceptable to the culture. One of them had to feign madness to survive. That's their problem. And now, of course, the young are looking at the internet and saying, hey, why them and not us? And of course, materialism needs no missionary. You only need to see what it's like to want it. Not that it's all good. It isn't by any means. It's only safe when you are a disciple. As long as the number of disciples that are in a society can sway the society, it will be good. What are the big problems that we in the West are failing to use? We were able to grow dramatically from the 18th century onwards because all sorts of things were, if you like, givens to society. Everybody went to church pretty well. They had to in England anyway, or they paid, or they could be forced to pay fines for not doing it. But it meant that the only reference text they had for behavior was the Bible. That's not a bad reference text. And so it wasn't the educationalists who made it. The explosion of learning in the Western world happen. I mean, you've seen what the Faculty of Education has done over the last 50 years. It's destroyed education because it doesn't have a proper anthropology. So, but coming into a world where the Ten Commandments were understood to be true, objective moral truth, so that arguments could be settled between people, the Bible says, that's how the Sermon on the Mount set us up to begin to understand it differently, to push it harder than it had been pushed before. The Jews had tried to believe that they could keep it, and God said, if you will keep it, you will flourish. And even their partial attempts did lead to flourishing in many ways. But we can't do it on our own. But when we bend the knee, because that is the truth, when we put truth above self-importance and self-image, it's humbling, but because it's truthful, it's powerful. And so what was present in the Western world was a set of ways of thinking about behavior, and therefore ways of behavior, of being, that was fertile soil for what happened first with the scientific revolution. Well, first with the religious one, then the scientific one, and then the artistic, intellectual one, which turned bad. That's the story we have to tell. So here are 9 questions. I'll give them to you quickly. They can be traced back all the way to the beginning. There's always been thoughtful people. And for the Greeks, for instance, they understood that these questions were important. They had to be answered. Now we pretend, well, we don't, most people don't even know they exist as such. When I discovered that for the first time, I was absolutely shocked. I said it in a lecture and got emails saying, where did it come from? They're these. They vary slightly in form, but these 9 work perfectly well. Where did I come from? Am I just the product of time plus chance, or is there a mind behind the universe? And is there any evidence that that mind might love me? That question has to be answered. Where did I come from? Aristotle tried to escape by saying, well, he didn't come from anywhere. That's all eternal. But of course, that's no longer tenable in the modern scientific world. He was wrong. But he understood the importance of the question. The endless regress, who made God, who made God, that has to stop at some point. He wasn't going to go down that foolish track. But he decided the world was eternal. He decided his own mind was the best thing he had, so he didn't even bother to check some of his mathematical ideas by going to the nearest cliff and finding that a big stone and a little stone fall at the same rate. They are not proportional to mass. He could have done that, but he didn't. Experiments are going to wait, another 1,000, 1,500 years. 1277 was probably, well, actually not, they didn't even do it. They only thought about it. Only in the next century, the 14th century, in Merton College, Oxford, did they get done in a systematic way, with a bunch of scholars whose names most people don't know, although, of course, they're all dominantly Christian. So when you have in place rules that everybody takes as a given, so deeply entrenched that they would be ashamed to do anything other than keep them, things can happen. But now we have in the States, we have a new head of NIH who accepts that probably as much of 80% of the literature, particularly if you include the social sciences, is not reproducible. Just think about that for a minute. 80% of the published science, which you were told in the COVID, we're following the science, but the science is only 20% reliable. Not a good idea. You need to express what that science is. They didn't do that. The data was there. The 3 dissenters who got challenged, and one of them, now the head of NIH, got it right. Only Sweden followed the advice properly, and they didn't lock down. They didn't put masks on their children, so they don't have a huge educational problem that's going to be with us for the whole of the generation that was kindergarten, early grades during the COVID. They cannot get going in the same way because they didn't have faces that they could see in school. How do you learn a language when you can't see what the lips are doing? Unbelievable. I mean, it can be done, but it's not the way to do it. So Jay Bhattacharya is setting out to try and change that again. But he can't go back to the Judeo-Christian standards immediately. So they've got to find technical ways, which they can do. They've got to have to pay a lot of money to see that results that matter are tested quickly and effectively under circumstances where you can be certain that the results are reproducible. This is going to be a slow process. I hope the Western world has enough, what's the word I want, humility to express that we have got this wrong, we have gone astray. I mean, when I started doing science, there were very few people in medicine who went off into the scientific track and did a PhD in science and then came back to medicine. That's relatively new. But, I mustn't get off on track on that one. There are lots of technical problems with the way it is done now, where you're not allowed in the modern system. It's become so rigid. Your height of creativity is the 20s, really. But nowadays, in order to get to an academic position, you spend your 20s doing other people's work. Your boss tells you what you're going to work on. And by the time you get your own position, you've lost the passion that you had at the beginning. Jayabhacharya understands that, and he says, well, you're going to need to give supportive grants to young people with good ideas. Many of them, perhaps most of them, will fail, but some will not. And they're the things that make a real difference. You see Nobel Prizes now given for what is applied technology. No, they should be for good ideas. And you don't have those. They don't come easily. I was blessed that I was allowed to pursue my own passions when I was in my early 20s. And that's a wonderful gift. Everybody who's got the mind to do it should be allowed to do it in that way. I wasn't doing what my boss told me to do. He was very interested and supportive, both of them are. But he let me go my own way, and by the grace of God, it worked. But we need to get back to a real understanding of how a safe culture can be produced. You can ask any bunch of students this question. Let's imagine for a moment that the People's Republic of wherever you are has decided you're not going to have any money, like in the lockdown when our government closed down bank accounts. That's terrifying. You've got a certain amount of money available at the moment before they take it away. Do you have anybody you could trust with it if you know they're going to go after you next? Some come from families where it could be done, but it's a few percent. The vast majority of young people are very, very short of trustworthy friends. Think about that. Think about the people in your life whom you could really trust. And if you've been privileged to grow up in a church that was reasonable, you will know quite a lot of very humble people who have not been educated even in the church as far as they should, but they love the Lord and they care about what we've been told to do, and they are trustworthy. They get on and do things. That was what the founders of America accepted. They couldn't write administrative law in the 1700s with this huge nation. No roads, really. They had to get there cross-country with horse and cart. They hadn't even built the railways yet. And then they had to think about how they're going to do it. And what the Constitution of the US does, and what is so brilliant, combined with common law, is based on Judeo-Christian thought. And take away that base, and you will be lost. Which brings me back to Jonathan Edwards. I mentioned this before, but it's worth mentioning again. I had an amazing conversation in Chicago around 2000, somewhere around there, with a Nobel laureate called Robert Fogel, who's now dead, secular Jew. And I happened to be in the university to do grand rounds, so they arranged for me to meet him. And the book was called The Fourth Great Awakening, because here was a man from the world's most famous department of economics, Nobel Prize winner, looking around, and late 1990s, 2000, he realized trust was diminishing rapidly. He no longer trusted his class. And they were going off to the best jobs in finance on both sides of the the equation, so to speak, Wall Street, where they were making the money, and the government, where they were controlling it. And of course, loyalty was going to trump truth. That's what led to the 2008 meltdown, by the way, which Robert Fogel, in effect, predicted, but didn't live to see, I don't think. I think he died before it happened, but I may be wrong about that. And what he understood was that it was the virtues that he had acquired from his Jewish culture which were getting lost. But I had the great privilege of introducing him to the fact that that was deeply rooted in the book of Deuteronomy. Being a secular, as he put it, red diaper baby, he hadn't really been exposed to that in the way that he should have been. When we lose the cultural narrative, we're in trouble. Tom Sowell is telling America this all the while, and now he's being listened to around the world. I mean, he's not going to be with us that much longer. He's in his 90s. He's beginning to look old, which is pretty amazing. 3 or 4 books since he was 80. That's an incredible performance. So go away and think about how you are doing your faith and what that should look like. And next week when we come along, I'm going to talk about prayer from the Sermon on the Mount, and you can be asking yourself in the interval, what are the 3 things that Christ tells us to do before we pray? Have a good week.